We're asking the question, what does Joseph teach us about ourselves and about God's will for our lives? And we find he is a remarkable human being, and often he's sort of brushed over. We don't really hear any words from him in the Gospels. In fact, there is no single line attributed to Joseph anywhere in the Gospels. He's this silent figure. And we quickly move to Mary, and we focus our attention on her, but this year we really want to look to see, what is it about this man that caused God to choose him to raise Jesus as his own? And what did Jesus learn from Joseph, and what can we learn from him? So as we do that, I want to just mention that Matthew begins his gospel in kind of a strange way. Matthew begins his gospel saying, let me tell you about Jesus, the Messiah, the King. That's what Messiah means, is King, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Let me tell you about Jesus. And he immediately goes into Jesus' genealogy. And this is one of those parts of the Bible, you get to these genealogical lists, and he's got 52 or 51 names listed in this genealogy. You get to those parts, you yawn, and you typically gloss over them. In fact, back in the 1970s, Reader's Digest put out a Reader's Digest version of the Bible. You may know this. It was the Old Testament was reduced by 50%, the New Testament by 20%. One of the parts that they left out was the first 17 verses of the Gospel of Matthew. They left out the genealogy. They're like, why do we really need the genealogy, right? But there was more here in this genealogy. Now, I will tell you that the genealogy itself, Matthew's genealogy, is already the Reader's Digest version of Joseph's genealogy, because it's missing. If you go back to the Old Testament and you retrace this through, it's missing multiple generations. He leaves out lots of people in the genealogy. So he's already giving us the Reader's Digest version of the genealogy. But what's interesting, and what you're meant to notice, is while he's cutting out, he's just throwing out names here and there and leaving certain people out, he actually adds 4 names that you wouldn't expect for him to include in the genealogy. And in this particular case, all 4 of them are women. He doesn't put in the women that you would think he'd put in, like Abraham and Sarah, or Isaac and Rebekah, or he might have put in Jacob and his wives Rachel and Leah. He doesn't do that. He chooses these other women, so let me just remind you who these women are. Tamar, you may remember, was forced to play the part of a prostitute in order to have children after her son had died. And then when we look at Rahab was living in the city of Jericho, and she was the town prostitute in Jericho who harbored the Israelite spies, the Hebrew spies, who came to spy out the land before they were going to conquer the Holy Land, the land of Canaan. And then when we look ahead to Ruth, you may remember Ruth was a Moabite. She was a foreign woman. Actually, probably all 4 of these women are foreigners. But she was a foreigner who experienced great grief and pain when her husband died in the land of Moab. And then she came back to the town of Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. She came back, and this is 1,000 years before the time, 1,100 years before the time of Jesus. And she found a husband, and you may remember the story. It's a beautiful story in the book of Ruth, where she finds this man, and she sort of ingratiates herself to him, and then she lays next to him and covers herself with a blanket with him, which is a sort of unusual way to get hitched up in that period of time, where the woman would do this, but she does, and he ends up taking her as his wife. And then finally, the one who had been the wife of Uriah. Matthew doesn't even name her, but we know her name is Bathsheba. So these are 4 women who you wouldn't put in a genealogy normally. You would say, wait a minute, these aren't parts of the story we want to lift up. But instead, Matthew says it's really important that you know that these women who had experienced pain and brokenness and shame, and who had been humiliated by the people in their communities, were part of God's redemptive story that comes to fruition in Jesus Christ. And that's why I don't want us to bypass this like we normally do, just to lay aside the genealogies, but instead I want us to just take that in for just a minute, because some of us have been in places where we experienced terrible pain. I don't know what your circumstances were, but whatever they were, God looks at you and he says, you are my daughter, you are my son, I love you. And even the most unseemly parts of your story, or the most painful parts of your story, put in my hands, I can redeem them and do something beautiful through them if you'll just let me. And I love that idea. We sometimes sing it in a song, but God makes beautiful things out of dust. He takes the broken things and he puts them back together again, and he makes them magnificent. And that's what he does in our lives. And if you look back over your life, the most broken things somehow put in God's hands, he has used to form and shape you into the human being that you are today. The good things about you may very well have come from the most painful experiences of your past, redeemed by God. Well, that takes us to the story that we have before us. And that is the very beginning of Joseph's story in Matthew's gospel, when Joseph and Mary are engaged, and Joseph finds out that the woman he's engaged to is pregnant, and he's not the father. So we're going to read the rest of the story, of course, next week, but let me just read it to you. When Mary, Jesus' mother, was engaged to Joseph before they were married, she became pregnant. Now, Matthew goes on to say this was by the Holy Spirit, and undoubtedly Mary tried to communicate that to Joseph, but I just want you to imagine, I tried to imagine, when I was engaged to be married to Lavan, if she had come to me and said, and we were very careful, we were not going to have, premarital relations before we got married, and so if she had come to me and said, honey, I just need to tell you something, I'm pregnant. And it was the Holy Spirit. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't it great? And I just try to think back as a 17-year-old boy, I was engaged, we got married right out of high school, the week after high school graduation, and I'm thinking, how would I have felt if she had come to me? Would I have believed her? And this is staggering to Joseph, right? I mean, even if you're not in love with each other yet, because these marriages were arranged, but still you feel humiliated by this, and you're broken by this, you feel betrayed by this, and so what's Joseph going to do? Now, what typically would have happened would have been that the man would have called this out. It didn't happen often, but the man would have called this out, would have gone to the priest or into the public square and would have said this certain thing has happened. But that's not what we find happens in the Gospel of Matthew. Listen to this. Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man. Because he didn't want to humiliate her, he decided to call off their engagement quietly. And so what Joseph has said is, I'm not going to expose Mary to that, despite the fact that my heart is broken. Despite the fact that she hurt me and betrayed me, I'm not going to get revenge. I'm not going to have her tarred and feathered. I'm not going to have people treat her as a harlot. I'm not going to have people, look at her in this way. I'm not going to do it. And so I'm going to when it says break off the engagement quietly, it was to divorce her and to claim that he was unhappy with her, and that's why they were getting divorced. What do you call that when somebody would act in that way? You call it grace. You call it mercy. You talk about forgiveness. It's remarkable. Now, we're going to find out next week that he's going to have a dream and an angel's going to speak to him and say, no, it really is true. This child really is of the Holy Spirit. But he doesn't know that yet in this story. Now, here's the thing. When I look at this, the sermon isn't really about infidelity. That just happens to be what the text is here, where Joseph thinks that Mary was unfaithful. What we see in Joseph is graciousness, and we see mercy, and we see forgiveness. And we see it here in such an amazing and magnanimous way. And here's what I have to ask. How many more times throughout Jesus' life as he was growing up did he see that in his Father? And how much did that shape this man who came to be known as saying, forgive, not just 7 times, but 70 times, 7 times, who taught people to pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, and who one day would hang on a cross and say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Today, the lesson is from Joseph. We're called to be people who are gracious and merciful, people who wish good and not evil, even upon those who have hurt us. And in doing that, we find life.